Hi there, Dave here with a video about flight log 4, the object-oriented version. We're going to take the string input that we were keeping in the flights array. Remember there was the 3-character site and a comma, and then the equivalent, the character form of the number for the distance, right? But it was all one string. And so now we're going to take that information, instead of storing it all in one big string and splitting it apart later on whenever we needed it here and there, we're going to make objects, flight objects, and we're going to store the flight objects in the array. And so the flight object that we're going to build is going to have the characteristics of the information that we kept in the array. So when we look at the class, which is the cookie cutter, this is going to define what all objects of type flight. Notice the capital F. The only time we see capitals is in the definition of a class. So this class called flight has got a constructor. This is what other languages call it. This is the piece of code that's going to be executed when you make a new one. And when you make a new one, you're going to have this code automatically executed, and what you're going to be given is access to the object that you're making, called self, plus the site that's being passed in that you're going to store, like was in the string at the beginning of the string before, and the distance. But this will actually be split apart already, right? This will be the real deal, not string equivalents. And so this code's going to be executed when you make a new one, and I'll show you that code in just a second. And what we're going to do is we're going to see if, look, the validation is done here. And the only time that I set the distance for the object that I'm creating, called self, is under the circumstances that the distance passes that test. Otherwise, I just get out of here, and there's a test. I can do a test to see whether I set that or not. So if I did set the distance, so if it was valid, if I did this, then I come down here and I validate my sites. So I have an array valid sites that I set equal to the pickle load. Oh, so it looks to me like what I'm going to do is I load site data just like it's a pickle, right? So instead of flight data bin, this is going to be site data bin. So I just save the sites out there, which means that in the initial load that I load that first, right? Yeah, we'll see that in just a few minutes. So we're still trying to get through the constructor, the code that's going to be executed when you make a new one. And so I got my valid sites now. And then I go through those valid sites looking for the situation where the uppercase matches what I have in the site. So if it matches, then I get out, break. I'm done. After I set the site. So if I've got a valid distance, I set it. And if I have a valid site, I set it and get out. Otherwise, I keep going. And once again, when I get out, if those variables aren't set, I can look and I do when I need to. Now, the other thing we want to see is that this flight not only has those variables, but it also has another method. It has another function called distance km. And self is automatically passed in. When you type in a method for a class, it's automatically put there. And so you have reference to the object that's being dealt with right now, which is called self. And so what you're doing is you're taking the value of the current object's distance, and you're returning that divided by 0.62137, which is the conversion of miles to kilometers. So when I call this method, and I don't pass in anything, the self is automatic, and we'll see that, then I'm going to just return self. So here is another thing I can do. Not only can I keep the information, but, not only can I keep the date, but I can return information. So it's a way of putting the code, collecting the code around objects so that mimic our real world. And that's what we're trying to do. So we have this object, and notice that it's in a file all by itself. And that's because I want everybody to use the same flight. And so I'm going to go ahead and import this no matter where I use it, like initial load and in the program that does the reports and stuff. So there's my class, which is going to define these guys. Where do we use them? Well, first place is in the initial load, because we're going to have to load the array with those flight guys, remember? So let's go take a look at this initial load. Well, it's kind of handy actually, because I'm using pickle to store the sites first. So look, I make valid sites, the array, and then I append these different strings to it. Yeah, it'd be a lot easier if I could put them all right there in the one line if I wanted to, but this works just the same. It's okay. And then what I do is I go ahead and I pickle dump it, right? So I take the valid sites out to there. You've seen this code, right? Well, look, here's the object stuff. So I still have my flights. That's what was filled with strings before. Instead of filling it with the strings, we're going to fill it with flights. So I append in that array, just like I would the string, but I append a flight object. And this is how I make a new one of these. This is how I execute the constructor. Every time when I do this, right here, this executes the constructor that we just talked about. So SOL and 12. So in the constructor, site is SOL and distance is 12, right? So at the end of this, I have flights that has 3 flight objects in it. And each flight object we know has, in fact, if it's valid, has a distance, and it has a site, and it has a distance kilometers. Of course, it could have lots more. So that's what we're getting every time we make one of these guys. These guys are just strings. This is how we did flights before, right? It's a nice comparison. Now, what kind of changes do we need to make to the main guy? Well, basically, everything just cleans up. Everything's nice. Notice, I suppose I should point out here, notice that we're saying from flight, import flight. So from the name of the file minus the py is assumed, and it's assumed that it's inside of the same folder that this file is in, that initial load py is in. And it's going to import from that the flight, which is the class. So from flight.php, import that class. And notice I do exactly the same thing at the top here of this guy, which means I'm using the same flight, and it is flight.py. And that's a common way of doing it. Name the file the same thing as the class, but smaller, lowercase, just lowercase. That way, no confusion about what's going on. And so here is the normal stuff. There's valid sites. Now, of course, when I come into main valid sites, I'm going to pickle load it, right? And just like I'm going to pickle load my flights. It's the same code as we saw before. Once again, pickle is a serializer. It will serialize anything that's in the array. It doesn't matter what it is. No matter how complex, how simplistic, whatever it's got in it, doesn't matter. It's going to do it right. No change to the code. Okay. Well, that's pretty cool. Well, what other kind of changes do we need to make? We're passing flights around. It's just different things. Well, one of the changes that we needed to do was down here. I decided that, well, display menu was really a display of strings, and display all flights was displaying our flight information. So I wanted to display the flight information, and I wanted to display it in the exact sequence in which it was laid out there. I don't want to sort it first. So let's take a look at this code because it shows how to use the objects. So what we're doing is we're going through all the flight objects. We're going through all the flights, right? This is the array of flights, just like the code, same code as before. But now we're saying flight sub I, the site of that. So we're printing the site with a comma, and then we're printing flights distance. So that's how we use those attributes that we set in the constructor of site and distance. Now add new site. Notice that add new site is going to have a pickle dump every time we do a new site. So that way we make sure that we don't lose our new sites that we keep. If we add a new site, we're going to have it there, and that works just fine. There's our add flight. It's actually much simpler. If you look at the old pseudocode, I didn't change any of the pseudocode. It's really, it's easier. So I said earlier we could check whether or not those attributes were set. And here's where I check to see whether or not the flight, that's known as self, right? That's the flight that I'm talking about. If the site is set. So that will be true if flight, inside of the flight, there is a site attribute set to something. And so that certainly will be a reason for me not to continue in that loop, as well as the X and the big X. Okay? So down in the run site report, the sort is changed. What we've done is we've used sorted. Now, sorted makes it possible. What sorted does is returns a copy of whatever array you pass in the sorted order that you want, which allows us to keep our data in the original format which it was loaded, right? It's in the sequence in which it came in. This is exactly the sequence in which it came in. But for reporting purposes, we can take that data and sort it down however we want, making copies of that data without actually sorting that data so we don't ever lose the sequence. So sorted is a really cool way to do this. And the way that sorted works is you just pass in the array, and then you tell it what object you're going to call it, and then what of that object, which attribute you're going to sort on. Oops, and the example was going to be age, so that should be sort by site. So now I've got it. I've got a copy called my flights, and then I go ahead and I do my normal thing. The thing that I don't do, that I do differently, is I no longer have this split, because my objects, when I come in here, they're already split, right? This is my flight sub I, the site, the distance. Once again, these are objects that are in this array, and these are the attributes of that object. Now down in the run min max is where I use the last attribute, or the method. Here's the distance km. So notice that what I do, for instance, is when I go to set the highest, or when I do my test, I check this, I'm doing everything in kilometers. So I'm not using miles at all. In fact, in the report it says in km, because I'm using kilometers. So I check to this arbitrary number is whatever it is, and then I always use kilometers for my tests. So I have the highest and lowest. And so we should go check that out real quick. So I have run the initial load. We can run the initial load again. And there it is. And so now if we go ahead and run 4, and we can go ahead and run report 5, for instance. There we go. There's our kilometers. So there's the high and the low. And so 59.55 and 19 and 32. So that's all in kilometers, and that was pretty cool. So take a look at that code and see how it all works and relates back to this flight. Once again, the object code is really not all that much different than the other code, this using of the objects. What we're doing is we're trying to consolidate the code. We're trying to put the methods with the data, with the attributes, and package them in these objects, and then deal with these objects in arrays and passing them around. It's a handy way to bundle stuff, and you've already seen how handy these things can be for, like, dumping out to a file. Anyway, it's our first blush at objects. Take care.